be a suitable habitat.
Well, let me just correct Mr. Corsier. The policy doesn't say 12 months, it says prior to, and that's accepted and endorsed by Natural England.
So I have the advantage. I do not have to follow Natural England. I can tell you what my view.
Without an ecological report.
I'm sorry, Mr. Elvey, I didn't catch that comment.
Mr. Corsier.
In terms of, the 12, sir, we consider the secondary school should be provided within the submitted allocated site, not that additional land, even just for playing fields, should be allocated. We feel that would be a natural extension to the site. So we haven't looked at any detail because we've only been aware of that very recently, but that is our view. And so we do note LDP actually say in their evidence that LDP actually send the evidence they could actually cater for increased numbers within the existing allocation. So this doesn't affect the number of dwelling. By having the secondary school entirely within the site would not affect the achievement of the required numbers. So in terms of 12, we say that the first line where it says demonstrate all transport issues have been addressed in consultation with Council and Highways England as necessary to ensure sustainable transport provision at the site is achievable. So we think that should be achieved. And there is a significant difference between whether it's achievable or whether the policy objective is to achieve it. And so the last sentence in 12, we would say that you should add the MPPF test where necessary proportion mitigation will be required so that residual cumulative impacts are not severe. Otherwise, sir, there's no measure in the policy. And so, lastly, whatever the traffic figures may eventually be, sir, we do know that this development will add large amounts of extra traffic onto urban roads, on roads within the main urban area where there are already problems of air quality. So we would recommend a similar criterion as suggested for ST4 on air quality, sir. Something like undertake an air quality assessment as there's potential for increased traffic flows from the development on roads within the urban area. And very importantly, so put in identified adverse impacts should be appropriately mitigated. So at the present moment, there's no reference to what are going to be fairly significant air quality impacts from this development. So that's all I wish to say on the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Corsier. Mr. Elvin? No, my apologies. Mr. Merritt first.
Thank you. Three issues. First, can I support Mr. Corsier's comment about the sustainable policy and the wording that it needs to be achieved rather than simply demonstrate it's achievable. Similar concern with the rewording in paragraph 15, where previously, where it said it will enable upwards of 15% of trips, is now just saying it's an overall aim to achieve it, which I feel is an unfortunate weakening that should not be accepted. Finally, the other issue, touched earlier on the concern that this development, with it being very car-based, could end up being particularly attractive to the Leeds housing market. In our previous submissions, when we were talking about the problems of so much of the new accommodation in recent years being snapped up for, in effect, for investment properties of various forms rather than providing housing for the local housing market, we made a suggestion that there should be a requirement, a general requirement, for prior marketing of all properties to the York housing market rather than in other locations. We know that some of the previous developments in the city have been marketed not just in London and the South East, but even outside this country prior to actually marketing locally. Whilst I make that point as a general one, we feel it would be particularly pertinent to this site, given its location near the A64. Thank you.
Mrs. Hilton.
Just on the policy, SS13.16, I think it is. I'm on the statement of common ground now. Yes, Haslington Parish Council would like to thank CUIC and perhaps LDP for listening about our anxieties for existing residents and businesses being able to use their normal route into Haslington, and that we welcome the fact that it says that vehicle access arrangements to connect premises along Common Lane, Long Lane to Haslington are retained and not altered as part of the wider ST15 access arrangements. Two things about that. First of all, not altered, I presumably means absolutely not altered. So no digital codes, no number plate recognition, none of the other gizmos that have been suggested over the past few years. They will just be open access roads as they are now. Secondly, you've omitted Langwith. Well, I'm hesitating because the postal address is Langwith Lane, but it's always referred to as Langwith Stray. So that is the third of the lanes that runs from the apex of ST15 down to the Tilmire. So that needs to be added into that list. And a second point, X13 on the same policy, create cycle and pedestrian routes along Common Lane, etc. They have got Langwith Stray in there, interestingly, and ensure no vehicle access. We would like...
Forgive me, I'm not quite sure where we are.
I'm on the new writing on the Statement of Common Ground, page 20, SS13, point, I think it's 13. It might have changed its number.
It is 13.
Is it 13 or 14? I think it's 13. It's where it used to say retain Common Lane, Long Lane, etc. as a cycle pedestrian route, and instead it says create...
I see, yes.
So either way, we would like that whole paragraph taken out, because we, for the reasons that we've said earlier, we don't think that Common Lane, Long Lane and Langwith Stray are suitable or appropriate to be made into cycle pedestrian routes. And we think there are better alternatives available.
So are you indicating again, Mr. Merritt? Mr. Laverick.
Just a quick consideration. I'd ask you to kindly look at the relationship between the proposed site of ST13 and Elvington itself. The site has been pushed further and further towards Elvington, away from the A64, for various reasons, sight lines, etc. There's just no buffer between ST15 and Elvington. They're literally, they're next door to each other, cheek by jowl. And we just feel it's not acceptable, given you're building over what is a sink and a large tourist attraction. It can be moved. We feel it can be moved without detriment to the facilities. And also just reiterate the traffic issues on the B1228 at present. It is a real problem. Day in, day out, it is a problem at rush hour. And the introduction of 1,000 extra dwellings onto that route prior to the construction of the graded junction on the A64 will just exacerbate that problem to the point where I would suggest the B1228 becomes unsustainable as a route into York. Thank you.
So just to be clear, I'm taking then final comments on ST15 from this side of the table, as it were, although some of you are actually physically on this side, before I look to the Council for a final reply, and then I'll be moving on to site ST8, or more than likely a short adjournment beforehand, at which point everyone not here for the other two sites are more than free to go home. So any final comments, because I won't look back to this side of the table once I've heard the Council's final word on this side. Okay, thank you. Mr. Elvin.
The mitigation, ecological mitigation, with respect, Mr. Corsier may not be obliged to agree with Natural England, but Natural England is the national advisory body, and there have been inputs from ecologists to this issue, and the provisions meet Natural England's requirements, and they're supported by expert ecologists. Secondly, on air quality, we touched on this in phase 2. As you know, air quality is improving, and the Fulford area was de-notified 2 years ago, and I think we gave you the reports on that. It will have to be considered as part of an environmental impact assessment, or whatever replaces it, environmental outcomes report, but it will have to be assessed as part of the planning application in due course, so it will have to be addressed. On sustainable transport, we don't, apart from the grammatical errors in the drafting of the policy, which need to say addressed, we think that's sufficient to flag up the issue. We don't think this is an issue of soundness. We don't need to refer to NPPF criteria. That's just duplicating national policy. That will have to be considered anyway if issues of severe impact arise, but you've already had a lot of evidence about what is proposed in terms of the transport. So far as criterion 13 is concerned, the pedestrian and cycle routes along common lane, etc., those are already public rights of way. And unless the parishes are seeking us to stop up existing rights of way, which would prevent their use by existing members of the villages, which I'm sure they're not, we can't prevent people using existing public rights of way. And it would make sense to regard public rights of way as ones which can be utilised by new residents as well. You will have your own plans, aerial photographs and site visits, but ST15 does not sit cheek by jowl with Elvington. There is separation, and you'll have seen that. You'll also, as I've already mentioned several times at this examination already, good reasons why the settlement proposed was moved from the original location closer to the ring road to the current one, and I touched on that in my response earlier, and I'm not going to repeat it. And as for the transport impact, yet it's Mr. Merritt who is arguing for a larger settlement. I don't really understand how those statements are squared. He says if it's got to go here, then we've got to have a bigger settlement. Well, in that case, the transport impacts would be increasingly greater than he is complaining about now. Our point is that we have assessed the transport impacts as a matter of principle. Mr. Ridge has already given his views on several occasions, and you have our updated infrastructure paper. And you've heard the proposals with regard to both local and national infrastructure. And also I've responded in terms of saying a larger settlement here would not be acceptable to historic England. So that is our response to the drafting points. Okay.
And just, I don't think, yeah, just one slightly sort of detailed point that Mr. Corsia raised about the 10% net gain. He said, in short, it should be 15 because the site promoter says it could be. What does the council say to that?
Well, 10% will be the amount, no doubt, required in due course. That's being fixed, as you know, under national legislation. We won't prevent the promoters from offering more if they're able to do so, but we don't see any basis for requiring more than the new national standard will require.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So that brings us to the conclusion of today's discussion on ST15. Is there anything else I need to pick up on before taking a short afternoon adjournment? Okay, very good. So I'm going to take a break for sort of 20 minutes and then come back to discuss, first of all, ST8 and then ST9. I now make it 15:05. Adjourn the hearing to resume at 15:25. Thank you.